Okay, so we're continuing in Matthew chapter 9, starting with verse 14, and we're going through my commentary on Matthew. And it says this: Then John's disciples, this is John the Baptist, came to him saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples don't fast? Jesus said to them, Can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch would tear away from the garment, and a worse hole is made. Neither do people put new wine into old wineskins, or else the skin would burst, and the wine be spilled, and the skins ruined. No, they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. So the first point that I want to make is that people's questions should be answered with pictures. We saw Jesus do this. He taught in parables, and the parables were just stories and mental pictures for people to understand spiritual truths. And this whole world is full of it. That's why it's so funny when people try to tell you that God doesn't exist, and it is so obvious in nature. And not only is it obvious in nature that he exists, but so many questions or so many answers to our questions are found in nature, and we see that in the parables. I'm actually working on my next book, which is a small group Bible study on pictures. I'm not going to say what the title is in case somebody writes it before me or publishes before me, but it's all about pictures and how these pictures answer our questions. Then the next point is that the presence of Christ cannot be contained in ceremonial procedures. So many people want to mix New Testament truth with Old Testament habits, and that's just not the case. And in this case, they're talking about fasting, which fasting is still for us nowadays, but there was no point in the disciples fasting because Jesus was with them, right? We fast because we want clarity. We fast because we want to deny the body and hear God better. But when God is there in the flesh, there's really no point, is there? And then, of course, he talked about the bridegroom parable too. But I think we can also use that don't mix the old with the new. The New Testament truth is different than the Old Testament law, which was, it even says in John chapter 1 that the law came through Moses, but grace and truth through Jesus Christ. And we need to make sure we don't try to mix them because they're not mixable. Right? You can't mix those two. You'll be torn up. It's not meant to be. So don't try to mix the Old Testament law with New Testament grace and truth. Just like he was saying, there was no point in the disciples fasting because he was there. The Bible tells us that the Old Testament was a shadow of things, right? So if you could see Jesus' shadow because he was around a corner and then he stepped out and you could see him, there's no point in focusing on the shadow or using the shadow to understand him when the shadow was good when you couldn't see him, but once you can see him, that's what you look at. That's what the Old Testament is. The Old Testament is the shadow of Jesus. And then he stepped into our world and we can see him. And so if what you see in the shadow is different than what you see in actually looking at Jesus in the New Testament, then you go with Jesus and not the shadow. In other words, when the New Testament and Old Testament say different things, understand that the Old Testament was a shadow. Focus on Jesus. Hold New Testament truth above Old Testament truth. And some of you might have a problem with that, but I'm just saying the Old Testament was meant to prepare us for God. So we no longer have to obey the dietary laws. There's so much symbolism in the dietary laws. There's so much symbolism in the Sabbath, but we no longer have to rest from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday. So I hope you understand this, and I hope you're seeking God on your own and reading the New Testament on your own.